call black everything. Everything black, culture over everything, y'all. We taking it back, black.
Welcome to Left of Black. I'm your host, Mark Anthony Neal, and we are joined today by Professor Jason E. Shelton, Professor of Sociology and Director of the Center for African American Studies at the University of Texas at Arlington. Professor Shelton is the co-author of Blacks and Whites in Christian America, How Discrimination Shapes Religious Convictions, published by NYU Press in 2012. And he joins us today to talk about his latest book, The Contemporary Black Church, The New Dynamics of African American Religion, also published by our friends at New York University Press. Of the Contemporary Black Church, Henry Louis Gates Jr., the Dean of African American Studies, writes, Jason E. Shelton has given us a thoughtful, comprehensive look at the myriad forces shaping the post-civil rights era Black church in the United States. What many perceive on the ground, he tracks in these pages with scholarly insight and analysis. The Contemporary Black Church is a helpful guide to the contemporary religious scene unfolding in society today. How are you doing today, Professor Shelton?
I'm doing fantastic, sir, and it is an amazing opportunity to be with you today. I greatly appreciate it, sir.
Thank you. So talk a little bit for our audience about your journey to this book, The Contemporary Black Church.
Wow, I appreciate opening with that. I've always thought that a lot of the great research that we've read over the course of our lives, we're supposed to be objective researchers, right? We're supposed to be kind of disinterested participants to some extent. But the reality of it is we have our walk in life, and it inspires us to write about things. And as a kid growing up in California, my parents, they left Ohio and went to California, and they both grew up in the Black Methodist tradition. And they put my brother and I in some churches in the LA area that were in that Black Methodist tradition. But then they started to expand out. And that's when I started to not realize it at the time, but I became very familiar with the diversity within the Black church, right? We hear this term, the Black church, and it's this monolithic one thing that's really home to a whole lot of Black folks who are Christians. But as I got older and I got exposed to, especially in graduate school, ironically, I didn't do a lot of research on religion at all in graduate school, but it would come during my postdoctoral fellowship at Rice University, working with well-known scholar, Dr. Michael Emerson. And we started talking about the sociological literature, and there's a very famous coding scheme called RELTRAD, which is short for religious traditions. And basically what RELTRAD does is it lumps all of us as Black folks together. If you're a part of those historic denominations, the AME church that I grew up in, or if you're a part of, the Church of God in Christ, or any of the 7 or 8 historic Black denominations, RELTRAD puts you all in the same category. Now, don't get me wrong, Mark. I understand why they do that. They're trying to show the uniqueness of the Black Protestant tradition. In a survey, when you're aggregating data for everybody, regardless of race, you put those Black folks that are in those traditions together to show the power of the Black church. But the problem with it is that it doesn't show the diversity among us. And you and I know this, that when we step into everyday Black churches, a Black Methodist church is different from a Black Baptist church.
Absolutely.
A Black Baptist church is different than a non-denom church, and a non-denom church is different from a Pentecostal church. So I knew that richness from my own walk in life, and I wanted to test it and show the diversity among us as Black folks. And so that's one of the places where my research started for this book. Another place was that when my wife and I moved here to Dallas-Fort Worth, we had a heck of a difficult time trying to find a Black Methodist church that had some young families in it, and that a place where we knew that we could raise our children and find other young Black families in the tradition. And we had a hard time, and we're thinking, good Lord, this is Dallas-Fort Worth. This is the 5th largest metropolitan area in the country. And if we can't find a young, thriving church, and we did eventually, don't get me wrong, it took a while though. And so that was also part of it. Why is it so hard to find a thriving Black Methodist church in one of the largest metropolitan areas in the country? So it was like my personal walk in life just kind of led to some of this scholarship along the way, sir.
One of the broad arguments that you make in the book, we understand the Black communities, and again, let's complicate the term community.
Yes.
Their investment in faith, their investment in the Black church broadly defined, was a reaction to an existential crisis that was going on in Black life.
Yes, sir.
Particularly around anti-Black violence and segregation and things of that nature. The argument that you make that's implicit in the book is that because those existential crises look different,
yes,
manifest themselves very differently, right? We now have generational wealth and things like that, quote unquote, political power with, Black electoral officials. The investment in Black faith in the Black church has shifted as the nature or understanding of those existential crises have changed.
Yes, no question about it. And again, this in your own family background and in the communities that you've grown up in. There was a time when, grandma and grandpa and all the old folks from previous periods, like church was essentially a mandatory thing for them. And that's where, in the sociological literature, there's an argument. It's been around a long time that the Black church is this semi-involuntary institution, right. That there's really a little bit of choice involved. Not a whole lot, just a little bit, whether you go in this Sunday and those kinds of things. Well, my data clearly shows, and this in general, Americans in general are moving away from organized religion. But my argument is that this is more consequential for us as Black folks. And at a time when, yes, we do have more choices. We are quote unquote free to be who we want to be and to walk to the beat of our own personal drum. So yes, we've got generations removed now from our grandparents who were anchored in a church, who have more options on Sundays than to go to church. And what does that mean? And what does that mean for the future of Black culture, the future of Black community, the future of Black politics? I agree with the longstanding arguments that have been around for decades, particularly advanced by Lincoln and Mamiya in sociology, and the argument about the greater Black church and how the church is essentially the preeminent institution in Black America that connects community, and our music manifests through the church, our politics, our economics. So many things come through there that's why we sort of took so many things for granted for so long. But now we're at a point where all that is changing. And not only is our sense of religion changing, but our sense of politics, a whole host of different things. And so that was sort of where I wanted to tap into. But in the end, I make the argument that it's essentially a growing religious individualism among us that is sort of shaping and giving way to slowly a religious collectivism that we've sort of used over our centuries in America.
One of the questions that you raise, and it's actually quite a chilling question, is that, what does African-American culture and African-American identity look like?
Yes.
In the absence of the Black church, right? And we can quibble with the term African-American, right?
Yes.
We could be saying Black because we're also dealing with the reality of Black folks who have immigrated to the United States, who are part of a broader Black community.
No doubt.
But for a long time, and I see this very often, and we'll talk about this more a little later, but in terms of how we think about reaching a Black community, right? You knew you could show up with a gifted preacher.
Yes.
And a very good choir with an extraordinary, lead vocalist.
Yes.
And a pretty good organ player
yes,
on the Hammond B3, that you would be able to reach a Black community. Those cues don't function the same way anymore.
Exactly. And it shows how complicated we've gotten as a people and how nuanced and how I'm fighting the argument that the Black church is a monolithic institution. But the reason why the Black church is not a monolithic institution is because we as Black people are not monolithic. And again, that sort of goes back to when I was a kid in California. I remember walking in the Holman United Methodist Church. And that was where we were for a number of years. And then my parents switched and went to West Angeles Church of God in Christ. I mean, you on
that's
a whole nother wavelength, homie, at that point.
You try to take selfies.
and that's that diversity among us, right? That's that diversity in an institutional setting, but it plays out with the different individuals that go to those churches.
Right.
And the different individuals who choose to not go to those churches. And the different individuals who choose to not go to church at all, or to convert away from Christianity. And so yeah, there's a an important story in there about a bigger story about. I use religion to tell the story of this diversity among us as Black folk in today's world.
You described the 3 Ds that really kind of frame your research in the context of this book. Denominational differences, demographic variations, and these debates about really are less political issues, but more often social and cultural issues.
Yes.
I want to start with the denomination piece because I think, as you talked about even earlier, most outside viewers of the Black church don't really understand the difference between these old mainline, more traditional. I mean, you can just hear it in the music.
Yes.
Right?
Yes, exactly.
And these Pentecostal traditions, which in particular, when we think about many of the African immigrants who've come to the U.S., over the last 3-4 decades, to the extent that they're drawn to Christianity as opposed to Islam, they're drawn to these Pentecostal traditions because they are widespread in the African continent. So talk a little bit, do a little deeper dig for the audience about these denominational differences.
I really appreciate this question because this is where you really get to the roots of the diversity within the historic Black church. So let me distinguish between, in the book, what I argue is the historic Black church and the contemporary Black church. When we talk about the historic Black church, we're really talking about 3 traditions that anchor the historic Black church. The Black Methodist tradition that I grew up in, the AME church was the first established denomination in Black America. And then the Baptist tradition, though, has always been the largest, right? There has been so many Baptist churches that the Baptists were so big and so diverse as well that they didn't have to form a denomination. They're just out there. Everybody knew that they were there. And then the last one that would come along would be that Pentecostal tradition, holiness Pentecostal tradition, a family of different denominations. And when you hear that sort of Black America has the same mainline evangelical divide that the broader American society has, it's the Baptists and the Methodists who are those that are sort of those, we're strong in our faith, but we also are willing to adjust and acclimate to modern America in certain ways. And you see that very clearly with the civil rights movement, for example. And you see that in a number of different ways where the Baptists and the Methodists in particular are out there saying, hey, look, we can use our faith, but still participate in the broader society.
And people also need to come to the church as they are also.
Yes, and come as they are in essence. Whereas our Pentecostal friends are like, nah, they're the evangelical branch of the tree. Right. If you think of the Black church as the tree, it's the holiness Pentecostals that are evangelicals. They are the ones who are far more likely to take the Bible literally. They attend worship services far more frequently and regularly than the Baptists and the Methodists. And so those are the historic traditions. But as I get into the book and I start to show you how religion has changed in Black America, it's the new non-denominational Protestant tradition that's growing in big numbers. In fact, they were something like 1% in the early 1970s when I'm looking at my data from the General Social Survey, and they grow to about 12% by 2018, which was the last year I analyzed in the General Social Survey because of COVID. You remember how everything changed. You couldn't really trust the survey data collected after that, and we're still in that kind of period. But anyway, it's that non-denominational tradition that's really grown dramatically. And while they have grown, it's particularly the Baptists and the Methodists who've lost lots of people. Yeah. And so that's where there's a lot of moving parts in there when you talk about the historic Black church and those 3 traditions that of old, and the contemporary Black church. There's the same 3 traditions, but add that non-denom family in there as well.
So, and to talk about that non-denominational piece for a moment, it is my understanding that very often those also tend to be more interracial spaces.
Yes, now I don't know what you want to save for later, but man, this is the part of the story, my man. There's a lot of richness in here, and I'll save some for later because I imagine we'll get into politics and things like that. But it is very true that so early in the book, I show some demographic differences across these 4 traditions. And by the way, I include I look at Black Catholics. I look at Black folks who are adherents of historically white mainline Protestant traditions like Lutherans and Presbyterians. And I look at Black folks who are members of historically white evangelical traditions. as well. And so I'm looking at a wide range. So my book is not just about Christianity. It's about I do interviews with Muslims. I do interviews with folks who are spiritual but not religious. I'm trying to capture that broad range of diversity. But when you get into essentially those traditions, the Black Methodist tradition has always been the bourgeois Black folks, right? We were the ones that said pastors have to have a college degree. You know, we had these very specific ideas about
we don't need them hooting and hollering. Right?
Yes, exactly. We banned all of that. Like, nah, y'all can't be doing that. Like, no. The Baptists kept all that going, and they kept the openness. And yet to be called, didn't put really strong stipulations on there at all. But I say all that to get back to the non-denoms, to say that the non-denoms have made us as that long-standing stereotype that the Methodists are the bourgeois Black folks within the church. Man, like in real world terms, Black non-denominational Protestants have completely surpassed us socioeconomically. Yeah. Black non-denominational Protestants are highly educated. They have far more money in their pocket. They're far more likely to live in the suburbs. And to your point, they are far more likely to go to most Black non-denoms go to predominantly Black churches. However, there are a growing number of Black folks who are non-denom who go to interracial churches as well. And so this is where there's a closeness to white America in that new non-denominational Protestant family that we don't see in those historic denominations. And so that transcends and moves into our politics and things like that, which maybe we'll get to later.
And where would you place some of these well-known Black ministers who are on television all the time, who have mega churches?
Yeah.
You know, where do they typically sit in terms of denominational
Typically,
status?
when you're turning on television, and I'm gonna be honest with you, Mark, I'm less likely to call names right now. You know what I'm saying? But when you're,
but we know who we're talking about.
You know who we're talking about. I want them to buy my book too. You know what I'm saying? And their congregations as well. But when we're talking about the fastest growing churches, and when you're talking about who you see on TV on Sunday, 9 times out of 10, these are non-denominational churches. Right. This is where these are the churches that have the resources, they have the people, they have the youth, and they have the resources to, you know, get that service on TV and to have that band and to that live band and the lighting and all of those things that it takes to have a more contemporary service that has that broader appeal in today's world. So don't get me wrong. There are a good number of Baptist churches that are sort of your mega churches that you'll see on television today. There are 1 or 2 AME churches that are out there as well. But generally speaking, it's that non-denominational Protestant tradition that you're seeing in Black America in particular. It's growing, thriving, and has that technology to be on TV regularly.
So let's talk about this idea of demographic variation, right? Where where Black folks are living to go to church. I grew up in New York City. To the extent that we went to church, we often traveled to Harlem from the Bronx to go to church. And I, as a child, I could remember walking down 125th Street and stunned that there literally could be 4 or 5 churches on a block.
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
And at least for the parishioners, that meant you're just leaving your house and walking downstairs and going to church on a Sunday morning. Right. It's also easier to pull people off the street.
Yes.
Right. To come into a church.
Yes. Yes.
You know, part of what you argue in the book is that it's really these older mainline churches that are still rooted in this particular urban space, you know, as we've seen Black sprawl, right, to suburbia and other places, right, that those churches don't hold the same kind of impact that they have, right? So we're seeing these tremendous demographic shifts that also change where Black people go to church. You know, those early moments of the civil rights era, right, the early 1970s when we start to see folks leaving Black communities, it was not unusual for folks who had left the hood to come back every Sunday to go to church. That doesn't happen as much anymore.
Not at all. And so can I get personal for a minute? So I talked earlier about how my wife and I had a difficult time finding a Black Methodist church that we felt was, you know, back home in Ohio at our home church, it's the old world St. James AME church. I'm always shout out St. James. That's the one I'm going to say, because that's my church home, right? Like to this day, if I step on a plane and I go home to Cleveland, I'm going to St. James. But I also knew that for our daughters, and we knew that we needed something younger, more contemporary, those same old hymnals, that same liturgy, some of that stuff had to change if we was going to connect with our kids. So we would go Arlington here in the Dallas-Fort Worth area is sort of in the middle. To the west is Fort Worth, and to the east is Dallas. And all in between, you've got a bunch of cities, and you got a lot of black folks that are spread throughout what we call the Dallas-Fort Worth Metroplex. One of the big historic congregations, though, is in Dallas, and it's called St. Luke's. And it's kind of the equivalent of our home church back in Cleveland, St. James. It's kind of the big one that back in the 50s and 60s was the heyday church where like your middle-class black folks went who were Methodists. So we went to St. Luke's a couple of times, and I was like, okay, this is closer to what we want. It's not as old, but, it's closer. And then someone said, you need to go to the South Dallas suburbs to a community called DeSoto, where St. Luke's has planted a church. And that's where those young black suburbanites who grew up in St. James go now, or at St. Luke, they go there now. And we said, okay, we walked in the door. We went one Sunday. My wife said right away, this is it, because the church had followed the migration pattern, right? They set it up in those South Dallas suburbs to follow the migration pattern. And so that's where I think there's we cannot ignore the growth of the black middle class and that suburban, that stronger suburban element, because a lot of us, are less likely to drive all that way. Now, mind you, we do. We just did it yesterday. Drove the 25 minutes from Arlington to DeSoto. But again, that shows you we couldn't find one even closer. So it's like we make that choice to make that drive. And again, it shows some of the big changes and the role of demography, but also the consequences of the demography as well. That if you don't grow, if you don't change with the times, you're going to lose a lot of people. And that's clearly what's happened with the Black Methodist tradition and the Baptist tradition as well.
And so this last of the 3Ds, the debate, and I am going to name a name here. I'm thinking about former North Carolina Lieutenant Governor Mark Robinson.
Yes.
Who is a black man who comes out of this evangelical tradition, right? Who had very, very strong opinions about everything from same-sex marriage to homosexuality in general, and many, this is someone who called himself, a black Nazi, at least until Kanye West picked up the mantle.
Yeah, no doubt.
And, when he was running for governor, in the fall of 2024, and I'm watching some of these debates play out in the group me of my fraternity, Phi Beta Sigma.
Oh, good Lord. I'm going to welcome you, man. Good brother. A all day, my man. But it's all good. I'm in your hood. So it's all good.
What struck me about the debates, because there's this interesting divides in all of these, brother D9 groups, right? PWIs versus the HBCUs. There are always these kind of class divisions, right? And all these kind of dynamics. And what's striking me is pretty clear. Now, part of this is a division between these kind of traditional black religious practices and these evangelicals.
Yes.
Right. So that when folks were having really contrarian views of how they saw this black man running for governor, that was really, it wasn't about Democrat or Republican or conservative versus liberal in that strict sense of the word. It really was about, this is someone who represents an evangelical tradition that I follow, right? So I'm beholden to follow him in a certain kind of way.
Right. And so you raise a great point. So I mentioned earlier that when we talk about the black church, and we have our evangelical branches within the tree, and we've got our mainline branches within the tree of the black church. On that evangelical branch we've got non-denominational Protestants on that branch, and also the Holiness Pentecostal traditions are on that branch as well. But as I show in the book, particularly as the book evolves and we get to the chapter on racial politics, for example, black Holiness Pentecostals look at those black folks that are non-denom, and they say, wait a minute, y'all are too closely affiliated with that traditional, historically white evangelical tradition. And so even though both of these groups of black folks are religiously conservative, take the Bible literally, have their strong opposition to homosexuality, have their strong opposition to abortion, and as well as a number of other things. When it comes to matters of racial politics, there's a clear difference there between holiness Pentecostals and black non-denoms. It's almost like, and it's very clear in the book, there are a couple of pastors that I talked to that say, wait a minute, they've gone too far. We get that they want to reconcile with white America, but they need to have white America deal with racism and the inequalities and disparities more.
Absolutely.
So, yeah, it's clearly there. So even among these black folks who are strong in their religious conservatism, they see matters of race and oftentimes very differently.
You talk about these moments of the disestablishment of the black church, right? 3 critical historical moments.
Yes.
The first wave of the Great Migration and black folks have to rethink their religious practice being in these new spaces. The civil rights movement, right? And its successes, right? Folks moving out of black communities and rethinking, with access now to change their lot. Right. Yes. In ways that was unimaginable a generation before. They're also rethinking religion. Right now, we're in this moment where we have a generation of millennials and Gen Xers who don't know those traditions. And again, as you mentioned, Martin Luther King and Malcolm X literally walked this earth 60 years ago.
Yes. Yes.
Right.
Yes.
And whatever political traditions and religious traditions they represented, they have morphed substantially multiple times, right?
Yes.
Since the 1960s. So what do you say now to those folks who are grappling with trying to find better ways to reach Generation X and millennials, Generation Alpha?
Right. No doubt. These are very challenging times. So Mark, I'm on the side of the equation in sociology that there's a thriving debate among researchers that argue that, is there such thing as secularization? Does secularization a reason why people are moving away from a religious faith? And there are reasons where, not to get too technical today, I won't do all that, but I'm on the side that says yes. But I argue that there's another layer to that for us as black folks too. Yes, we live in a modern, secular, fast-moving American society, but we as black folks have greater access to this society and to the resources than we've ever had before. And so I think, Mark, and you've seen where I get to this in sociology, a bad word in my field is the A word, and it is assimilation. And I am on the side of the equation, bro, that says, yes, I'm not saying that black folks are becoming white fully the way we think of assimilation in America, where groups give up everything and essentially become white. I don't think that's how it plays out in the modern day. Maybe for some, but not all groups. But I do think that there's a greater similarity with whites. And I do think that that's where some of this is beginning to come through with respect to us and African Americans in today's world. And so things are just, when we talk about the previous generation, if you want to hold them to keep them in the pews or keep them in the mosque or keep them in the temple, you got to get rid of some of this formality. I mean, these young people don't like formality. Mark, you know this. These young people come to our classes today. They look like they rolled out of the bed when they walk into our class today, right? There's very little formality. So you can't expect them to have religion and formality. And another big thing that needs to happen is that generational change has come to the point that if you want to keep these young people, you better give them positions of power now. The idea of waiting their turn is like, hey, look, they're going to do other things with their time rather than wait. So some generations of black folk who've been hanging around for their time, maybe they shouldn't get their time. If you want to hold these young people, you better get them in so that they can bring in more of their friends to help replenish the institution.
Let me ask you this question, particularly around the black church and politics, right? I mean, a significant amount of black political leadership literally came directly from the church.
Yes. Right.
Folks who were going to Congress and doing their 10 months out of the year, but still pastoring at their churches on Sunday. I'm thinking about someone like William Gray, in Philadelphia is one example of that. There was always this sense that to ascend to political leadership within the black community, there had to be strong evidence of a connection to the black church and what the black church represented morally, right?
Yes.
And we could make that had been the argument across American politics generally.
Yes.
Right. You might not have had to be a pastor, right? But you had to show some sort of moral fortitude. When you look at the political landscape now and to think about who has been elected to various positions, including the presidency, do you think that has lowered the bar in terms of what the Black community will expect in terms of political leadership coming out of their own community, right? There's an argument to be made that Barack Obama not only wouldn't have won with white folks, but would never have been supported by Black folks, right, if we didn't believe that he was morally sound and had some connection to the Black church, right?
Yes.
And he also needed to sound like
he
had some connection to the Black church.
Oh, yeah, definitely. I still think that legacy is there, but it's not nearly as strong as it once was.
Right.
As you know, and I get into this in the book, that there was that time in Black history where the preacher was the most educated person in the room. And throughout slavery, the preacher was probably the only person who could read the book. That's why he could read the Bible and interpret it to others.
And by design. Right?
Yes, exactly.
And by design. Right.
Not anymore, though, right? These preachers have been completely outflanked by, a growing Black middle class and growing college-educated Black folk population. And this is another theme in the book where people talk about, hey, if I earned my college degree, I want to be in a church with somebody who's got a college degree. Yeah. Or if I've got a PhD, I want to be in church with somebody who else has a PhD. And so the thinking is that for a lot of us in everyday Black America, we want to be with somebody who's an expert in their field, the way that we've made the sacrifice to become quote unquote experts, generally speaking, you know what I mean, with a degree in whatever it is that we do. And so, yeah, we still are connected to that leadership model, but in terms of the church, but it's not nearly as strong as it once was. And that's where, again, that sign of the greater assimilation, that sign of more secularization, moving into mainstream America and saying, oh, well, maybe I don't need I don't need to have as much of I'm more educated than my pastor. So, I need someone who's more educated. Is that sign of sort of impacting by that influence of the broader American society on us?
Fascinating conversation and a wonderful book. We've been joined today by Professor Jason E. Shelton, Professor of Sociology and Director of the Center for African American Studies at the University of Texas at Arlington. He's the author of The Contemporary Black Church, New Dynamics of African American Religion, published by our friends. We are label mates at New York University Press. Thank you for joining us today, Professor Shelton.
I greatly appreciate the opportunity to be here, sir. Thank you so much.
Blacks, they be hyping, I'm the light that lit your match. A black watch for all the times I watch MTV raps. Black lights and booze burn when I record for Watts. And every black like Troy Davis who never had a fair shot. All black, everything black, culture over everything.